What if Beyonce made a traditional country album? That's the scenario we'll be discussing on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that each week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Texas Hold'em by Beyonce, and I tried to reimagine that in a traditional country style, whatever that means. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. Now, I'm not really someone who generally pays a great deal of attention to award ceremonies and the like. The kind of music that I spend most of my time listening to isn't the kind of music that ever gets nominated for awards, so most of the time I just kind of let these things go by, but I couldn't really ignore the furore around award season last year when Cowboy Carter was up for a bunch of different awards at the Grammys. I was nominated in many categories and won a bunch of different things, but I guess the one that everyone was talking about was the Best Country Album award, just because very unusual for a black artist to be nominated for that. And obviously when it did win, a lot of people were really excited and delighted by that, and rightly so. I mean, it's quite an achievement. And it's an album that does offer a pretty refreshing and unique, highly stylized take on different aspects of country music, very much from Beyonce's perspective, which I think is a really interesting thing. And I think it's right that the Academy rewarded her for that, because it was phenomenally successful as well. So most people were very happy about that, but I did definitely see a few more, shall we say, conservative types, particularly dipping into the cesspool that is Twitter. It always shows you the very worst opinions. Definitely saw a few more right-leaning types getting very upset about the idea that Beyonce could ever release anything that was considered to be country. Certainly at that year's CMA Awards, the Country Music Association, the album didn't even get a nomination. So I guess that kind of furthered this discourse as to what constitutes country music. Can a Beyonce record be considered to be country? Is refusing to nominate this phenomenally successful record that is, at least by, broad definitions, a country record, is not nominating that for the best album of the year explicitly racist? That kind of debate starts raging. And then a little while after that, we got the news that for the Grammys next year, rather than just having a country album award, the country section has been split into two different categories, and now there's contemporary country and traditional country, which some people immediately saw as, oh my god, the Grammys have realised that black artists are starting to infiltrate the country world, so now they've had to create separate categories so that white artists can still win the award, and declaring it as a new era of segregation and what have you. And I don't know how true that is. I suspect it doesn't really end up breaking down that way, but it did seem odd, certainly at that time, that they'd chosen just that moment after that historic win for Beyonce to suddenly make this change. That's what prompted me to start thinking about this week's song and video idea. And I was happy to engage with something that Beyonce's done, because I've never been a massive sort of mega fan, but I've always enjoyed her work. Going back to Destiny's Child, I thought they had some absolute bangers for a good number of years there. And I've never sort of deep dived into her solo work, but quite often hear the singles that she's put out and enjoy those. Crazy in Love, is an absolute masterpiece. I'm a big fan of that Rich Harrison go-go and infused production style. She has done some great stuff over the years, which continue to sort of challenge expectations about about herself. She could very easily have stuck to doing really kind of safe, middle-of-the-road R&B stuff, and people would just lap it up. She could just very easily just be living as a legacy artist by this stage, but she's never really taken the absolute easiest road. Continues to come up with challenging sounding records, and then Cowboy Carter was just another pretty bold and quite unexpected sideways step. I think just because it comes from such a high profile artist as well, it does go a long way towards correcting perceptions of the relationship between black musicians and country music, and sort of cementing the place of black musicians in that legacy, because although there have always been black artists working in country music, I think the overall perception for just casual listeners is that it's an overwhelmingly white form of music. So to have someone like Beyonce make this album and include the likes of Linda Martell, groundbreaking black country vocalist, alongside white country legends like Willie Nelson and Dolly Parton, and then sort of contemporary performers as well, like Post Malone and Shabuzi and what have you, all sort of together. I feel like it does sort of make quite a powerful statement about black artists' contribution to country music and the sort of interconnectedness of that with other predominantly black musical forms, R&B and hip-hop and what have you. So it kind of makes a bold statement about Beyonce's own place within a country tradition, but at the same time, I don't think anyone listening to that record could ever claim that it's in any way traditional country. It uses quite a lot of elements from traditional country music, like for instance on the original version of Texas Hold'em, you hear banjos, you hear acoustic guitars, you hear fiddles, but they're all used in a very kind of stylized way. It's a very modern production. I think throughout, rather than it being Beyonce going and making a record in the strict country tradition, it's Beyonce taking elements of country tradition and using them as tools to make a Beyonce record, if you see what I mean. So the creation of a new traditional country category at the Grammys, definitely one way to create a category that absolutely excludes a record like Cowboy Carter, which I think is probably a lot of the reason why people were quite upset by that and jumped to the conclusion that it was a decision inspired by racism. It is an odd choice because as well as the country album category, there's already an Americana album category, and Americana tends to be the term that people use to describe a lot of the country music that's happening outside the mainstream, which you would think is also kind of quite often the stuff that would fit into a traditional country category. So you wonder how much there's going to be an overlap between those two things. And I've read people saying, oh no, Americana should be more to do with American folk music and other kinds of traditional American music. But given the lineage of country music, surely that creates a massive grey area and does make you question what exactly they consider to be traditional country. What particular sound from the past 100 odd years of country music is the thing that you would consider to be traditional? Because I don't know if I could nail down one thing and say, oh, this is traditional country, the other stuff isn't. Because at its root, country music is essentially indistinguishable from folk and blues. You listen to a lot of songs originating in sort of the late 19th, early 20th century. It's often very hard to distinguish between what would be considered blues and what would be considered folk or country. I think I've mentioned it before, but the Harry Smith anthology, the Smithsonian Anthology of American Folk Song, really kind of makes this point clearly, because if you listen to some of those records without reading up about the performers and learning about their background, you have no idea which performers are black and which are white. And that takes away that perception of, oh, this white performer is a country performer, this black performer is a blues performer. Mississippi John Hurt, without knowing who Mississippi John Hurt is, sounds like a country singer. Doc Boggs, without knowing who Doc Boggs is absolutely a blues singer. Even looking at someone very famous like Jimmy Rogers, quite often considered to be the sort of a founding father of country music. Those early big hits, Blue Yodel, number whatever it is, T for Texas, it's just a blues song. Fair play, it's a blues song with yodeling in, but it's just a blues song. So all of that music, blues and country, it's that combination of songs derived from traditional field hollers combined with European folk song forms kind of mashed together, and that's where all of that comes from. So there's been a lot of black music, if you like, in country music from day one. But yeah, maybe traditional country, as they're defining it, maybe it just means that country music that harks back to a specific point in the genre's history. But do they mean stuff that sounds like Jimmy Rogers, or do they mean stuff that sounds like Ernest Tubb? Are they thinking Hank Williams? Is Hank Williams traditional enough? That kind of honky-tonk feel? Or is that already a bit too rowdy? It's quite old now, so maybe that's traditional. But if that's traditional, is Johnny Cash traditional? I mean, he was practically a rockabilly at the time. Surely that can't be traditional. Or are they thinking of the more smoothed out commercial Nashville sound, Countrypolitan? And that's absolutely a commercialization of the traditional country sound. But to some people, that might be considered to be traditional country. There've just been all these different sounds over the years, all these different styles, all these different approaches. Each of them was new at some point, and at some point, with the benefit of a bit of hindsight and some nostalgia, they probably become considered to be traditional. It seems kind of futile to me to have a category that's called that when the decision about what's traditional and what isn't traditional is, as far as I can gather, utterly arbitrary. Case in point, I did just glance at what had been nominated for it this year, and I think one of the nominees is Willie Nelson, and Willie Nelson's a wonderful songwriter and performer and a venerated legend of the genre, but initially became kind of famous as a performer as an outlaw. He was one of the guys who was rebelling against the traditional approach of Nashville. So for a guy who's famously an outlaw to be considered now traditional, to me suggests that the whole category is a bit of a mockery. Anyway, in the end, it's an award show. It doesn't really matter. It's just the timing of that decision, I think, always leaves just a little bit of nagging doubt that there's a little bit of bigoted or closed-minded thinking going on in that decision. I hope that's not the case. But yeah, that leads me to this week's alternative universe scenario anyway, because what I figured was, for this week's scenario, in my alternative timeline, everything's proceeding as it was in our own timeline. You know, Beyonce releases Cowboy Carter, it's a great success, wins the Country Album of the Year Grammy, and gets snubbed at the CMAs, and then the Grammys announced the creation of this new traditional country category. But instead of just carrying on with her life and ignoring all this, as Beyonce has sensibly done in the real world, in this alternative timeline, she takes this as both an affront and a challenge, so promptly re-records Cowboy Carter completely, getting rid of any sort of contemporary arrangements and bits of approaches, and instead delving back into the Hank Williams style honky-tonk and the sort of Bakersfield sound, that Buck Owens, Merle Haggard kind of thing, using a bunch of veteran Nashville session players to get that really old school sound. And of course, it being Beyonce, the re-recorded album's a complete triumph, breaks all sales records again, and goes on to win the Best Traditional Country Album in the coming year's Grammys, and even grudgingly manages to receive a nomination from the CMAs that year. So in attempting to convert Texas Hold'em from this kind of stylish, modernised take on country into a more traditional sounding country record, as ever, my first take was just getting the isolated vocal, dropping it into GarageBand, syncing up to the grid, and setting my tempo. The original tempo is pretty kind of popping, it's fairly rapid. I wanted a slightly more laid back, slightly honky-tonk feel for this, so slowed it down a touch. Also did a little bit of editing just to take out the whistling solo, because kind of got in the way of what I wanted to do in the instrumental section, so got rid of that. Programmed some drums on, nothing fancy at all. It's mainly just low-key kick, hi-hat and rim shots with the occasional little fill. Fairly restrained, but it just keeps everything ticking along with a little bit of swing and just a little bit of drive. I did actually mean to put some live bass on, but just as a placeholder, because my bass was in the other room and I was too lazy to go and get it, I played in a bass line on my MIDI keyboard just using the upright bass sound from GarageBand, but ended up liking it so much that I just left it on because it lends an extra fun sort of old school vibe as well. Next I went for guitars, so there's a few different guitars on there. There's an acoustic rhythm guitar, which is pretty much a must for any country record, so nothing at all fancy, just really basic country strum. I think the song's in D, but I played it with a C chord shape with a capo on the second, just for a slightly different chord shape. Nice kind of ringy open chords. I had an electric rhythm guitar as well, just doing the Tennessee 2 muted kind of bass line thing, so essentially just doubling what the bass is doing, with a palm mute boot and quite a lot of reverb. Just adds a bit of kind of extra propulsion and another nice texture. And then I've got a lead guitar, again, a nice kind of fairly clean, just slightly breaking up on the edge kind of reverby sound, which improvises little fills all the way through, attempts at James Burton kind of chicken picking, that kind of thing. Your fairly standard country stuff, popping in there and commenting in between the vocal. And then for a bit more country authenticity, I also really wanted something that sounded like pedal steel. I don't own a pedal steel guitar. They're very expensive. Wouldn't know how to play one if I did have one. So tried to slightly recreate that by just adding another 2 electric guitar tracks. Played with a slide through a volume pedal. I just tried to harmonize those so I could get that thing you get with pedal steel sometimes of a held chord but with one note changing. So it doesn't sound super authentic, but I think as long as you're not listening to it too closely, it kind of fulfills that role in the sound. Also wanted to have some fiddle on there. Again, don't own a fiddle and don't know how to play it, so I was onto GarageBand sounds again. I used the same sound that I used a few months ago in my Bluegrass Billy Joel record. I've forgotten what it's called. It's like a Chinese stringed instrument which definitely has a more fiddle-like texture than the classical violin sounds that you've got on there. So just that sort of slightly sharper attack and a slightly rougher timbre to it. So I've got 2 tracks of that just playing in harmonies, like either having 2 fiddle players or just one double stopping. And then as a final touch, just in the verse after the instrumental section, has a slightly different feel where I move to a bit of a snare shuffle in the drums. Everything else kind of mutes a little bit. So for a bit of a different instrumental texture in there, I just added a little bit of lonesome sounding echoey harmonica. Just adds a bit of atmosphere to that one section. And then for the video, as usual, started out by just finding some decent performance footage of Beyonce doing the song, sort of sync that up with the track as best I could. Obviously I wanted an old school country kind of backing band, so edited in some footage from, I think it's Buck Owens and the Buckaroos, the great old Bakersfield band. We've got bits of them in there just providing some instrumentation. And also, because the Buckaroos don't have a fiddle player, I borrowed some footage as well of Merle Haggard and his band. I don't know if they're still called the Strangers at the time. I think it might actually be from about 1980. But yeah, Merle and there's 2 fiddle players, so they're just edited in there too, soaring away, which hopefully gives a bit more of the feel of her kind of being backed up by a band of grizzled country professionals. And then to complete the slightly careworn old school feel of everything, I added a bit of a sepia filter to everything as well, just to make it feel a bit old and warm and faded as well. So I hope you enjoyed this one. It's one where I started with the sort of conceptual framework created by current events rather than the idea for the song, but I like the song anyway. It's a good, fun, daft throwaway track, and I really like doing country stuff. Kind of grew up with a bit of that, so it was good getting to dust off some of those old country licks and try and place Beyonce in this more honky-tonk setting. So if you did enjoy it, please let me know down in the comments. If you could like and subscribe, share, any of that stuff, that also really helps. Always appreciate your support. If there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any songs or artists or genres you'd like me to take a look at, do let me know. I am forever grateful for your suggestions. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will hope to see you next time.